So I just wanted to say, first of all, that I'm coming from a different place because I'm not an art historian. I'm coming out of cultural studies, and I'm also an activist. And so, but it's been very, very useful for me to hear what you've all had to say so far. I feel like there's a lot that I've learned. And so, I wanted to thank the organizers for putting this on and for everyone for speaking. So, some of the work that I'm doing now, some of it is looking at resistance, but some of it is also looking at how resistance is silenced, how resistance is stopped. And so, I'm afraid this is going to be a bit of a pessimistic account, but it's really from the goal of truly trying to understand certain processes that are about social anxiety in the context of austerity. So I just wanted to, so what I'm talking about here is a tendency within the current economic climate, which is about a kind of, what I'm calling kind of new moralism, which is deployed by politicians, by press commentators, and unfortunately certain elements within the general public, which ends up silencing resistance to austerity. And I would say that what this does is it's shaped by and also perpetuates dominant narratives about the causes of the recession, that it's not caused by the excesses of the financial sector, but instead by an overly generous welfare state and an overly permissive immigration system that results in the wrong people having access to public services, such as the unemployed, the disabled, single parents, and immigrants, for example. And so, so this image is from the Conservative Party conference, and notice the slogan for hardworking people. And there's a sense that, the hardworking people aren't actually any of us. So I just wanted to start out, sort of who are these hardworking people? And I want to say that, so the new moralism I'm saying it's not only a narrative about who caused the crisis, but it's also a certain kind of public mood. And which I'd see as a sense of melancholy and nostalgia for an earlier moment when livelihoods were supposedly more stable and lives were more authentic, like the 1940s, when evoked by those "Keep calm and carry on" posters. And related to this, there's also a guilty sense that we're living less virtuous, healthy lives after the binge years of credit-fueled consumerism and open borders, and so now must repent and return to those worthier times when people knew how to mend things and didn't eat fast food or own flat-screen televisions. And the poverty and hardship of that time is often ignored, let alone what it would have been like for you if you were a woman, if you were queer, or if you're an ethnic minority. We can interpret this nostalgia, I think, in terms of a loss of hope for the future, particularly hope for a better world, making it tempting to romanticize the past. And there's some truth to this, as many people believe that young people will be worse off than their parents, as they'll be faced with declining wages, insecure employment, and unaffordable housing. And what I'll be talking about a little bit later on is about the figure of the unemployed graduate as exemplifying this anxiety about hope for the future. But I'd say that this sort of moralism, this austerity moralism, also bears certain similarities to older forms of moralism. And one of these, there's a long history of kind of ideas of the deserving versus the undeserving poor, but there's the assumption that certain categories of people are taking advantage of the hard work and sacrifices of the majority. And this is explored in the 1970s context through the book Policing the Crisis, which explored how the discourse of mugging entered the British media context from the US. And I thought what was quite interesting, I've been revisiting this book, and what I think is quite interesting is that the authors examined the rhetoric of hard work. Hard work defined as arduous toil, as routine, and as they say, expenditure of time and denial of pleasure. And so you have hard work, and then you also have this contrast between the hard workers and the skivers. And this provided, as I say, a vocabulary from some very powerful moral feelings about social change and the loss of traditional values. Because the label of skiver was implied in a quite indiscriminate fashion and without really much evidence. So it was not only the unemployed, but it was also what they called outgroups, which included the poor, included young people, included students, and included black people. And they argued that in the vocabulary of social anxiety, blacks and Asians became ready-made symbols for and symptoms of a succession of dislocations in housing, neighborhood, family, sex, recreation, law, and order. So I think what is interesting here is this idea of, if you have the hardworking majority and then you have these other groups of people who are supposedly taking advantage of them. But it's to do with these and with groups in society that are associated with social change, and somehow they become seen as skivers. So what I'm really interested here is that kind of slippage between, kind of a group in society is defined as an outsider, and then somehow they become seen as taking advantage. They're seen as skivers who are taking advantage of the majority. And another precedent of this is the discourse of the underclass, which became prevalent in policy circles in the 1980s and 1990s, and I think at this point in time has become a received idea and has involved in many ways the depoliticization of class. So the underclass was defined as existing outside the mainstream of society, as undisciplined and unaccustomed to the routines of work, and the bogeymen of the underclass were generally the kind of unemployed young man and the single mother. But as criminologist Jock Young has argued in The Sociology of Vindictiveness, the underclass discourse also became popular at a time when flexible capitalism was exacerbating job insecurity and declining living standards, meaning that many people were actually a lot closer to the underclass than they would like to admit. And drawing on the work of the social psychologist Sven Reinhoff, Jock Young theorized this situation through the concept of resentment as a process by which those who must exercise a great deal of personal restraint in their everyday lives due to the conditions they're living under, envy those who they see as able to satisfy the pleasures and desires that they are denied. And Jock Young also argues that precarious work and the instability associated with global capitalism has led to an intense drive for ontological certain release, insecurity, and deprivation. And so what happens is this drive for ontological certainty, combined with the kind of divisive rhetoric of the underclass discourse, produces sharp divisions between an us and a them, which are laced through with anger, guilt, and shame. So there are these two tendencies identified by these authors I've discussed that have done, I think, considerable ideological work. And I think in some ways they're setting the stage for what we're seeing in austerity. So there's the production of the outgroups, and the idea of that certain categories of people become symbols of social upheaval, and then claiming without any proof that they're taking advantage of the hard work and everyday sacrifices of the majority. And second, there's a politics of resentment at a perceived underclass, as at a time when we're in greater danger of slipping into it, as in that North American expression that we're all three paychecks or three pay packets from poverty. So how do these dynamics play out in the context of austerity? And I would say this idea of the hardworking majority who's exploited by outgroups is I think really being exploited at the moment. But I think we have work as this idea of hard work as this metaphor. But I would argue that it's not just hard work in terms of the drudgery of bad jobs, but it's also about the hardship of living with austerity, making do with less, giving up pleasures, and in some cases giving up with necessities. Because austerity exacerbates the conditions of precarious work that Jock Young talked about, while politicians in the media simultaneously use this divisive rhetoric about scroungers versus hardworking families. And I would say that essential to understanding the sorts of dynamics in the present is the idea of debt morality, which Maurizio Lazzarato has explored in the book The Making of the Indebted Man, which is about, he's trying to understand a kind of moral, how debt is framed as a kind of moral imperative. I mean, it's a moral imperative to pay off debts at whatever human cost. And he reminds us, actually, that the word for debt is very similar to the root word for guilt. So he argues that within the context of austerity, social rights, such as unemployment insurance or health care or the minimum wage, become transformed into social debts. And then beneficiaries become debtors, and repayment means, as he says, adopting prescribed behavior, which is characterized as taking on the costs and the risks of the financial crisis as an individual, and accepting declining living standards. And for young people, conventional markers of the foregoing conventional markers of adulthood and financial independence. Debt morality also neutralizes politics by preempting questions about the terms of debt repayment, such as why people are being asked to make personal sacrifices and who benefits and who suffers. I mean, Lazzarato doesn't really talk about this, but debt morality also causes unpopular groups to be perceived as a drain on the scarce resources of the welfare state, such as the outgroups identified by the authors of the Policing the Crisis, or the so-called underclass discussed by Jock Young. So because Lazzarato is talking this very much in sort of economic terms, what he doesn't talk about is the kind of into forms of image and others, talks about the idea of social abjects or national abjects, which then becomes seen as again a sort of undeserving, I think as access to the welfare state. And I'm not going to talk more about it because we've heard enough about it yesterday. But I think I think the concept's been quite useful in trying to understand this kind of return to this social conservatism in the moment. But then what happens when this all happens at a time when when our sort of jobs and lives have become more insecure, where we're in danger, possibly some of us, of becoming social abjects or becoming part of the underclass that Jock Young talks about it. And so the coalition government's austerity measures place many people at risk of unemployment and destitution, but they simultaneously demonize the unemployed and destitute, and this creates further pressures to separate the us from the them. And this partly explains why there have been stories so far about the scapegoated scapegoating each other. As in this quote from Fern Brady, so based on some research that she did for the Joseph Rowntree Trust on attitudes towards benefits. And she says that the disabled people think it's wrong the drug user down the road gets methadone. The drug user is outraged that the large family next door gets a spare room and hopes they're hit by the bedroom tax. The large family is sick of elderly people getting big houses they don't need. And then the elderly woman hopes these large families are forced to stop having kids once the money dries up. So, this I just find this very disturbing, as it's a complete absence of any form of social solidarity at all. Now, it's these sorts of reactionary responses to austerity that I'll explore now. So what I'll be looking at for the rest of the talk is the reactions to the unemployed graduate Cait Reilly, who basically who challenged the government's austerity measures. And I think the unemployed graduate is central in terms of this idea of kind of thwarted hope for the future, but also because a lot of the sort of government's austerity measures in this country and elsewhere have been, in many ways, disproportionately affect young people. And this is something that Paul Mason has written about quite a bit in his book, Why It's Kicking Off Everywhere. But it's this idea, for example, like if you go to university, you're supposed to have a good job and a better life, but that's kind of not happening anymore. But it's kind of, I think, stirring up a lot of social anxieties around young people, around the future, and so on. So Cait Reilly was a geology graduate at the University of Birmingham, and she was unemployed for 2 years following graduation. And during this time, she was volunteering at a museum. And then as part of the Department of Work and Pensions work program, which is basically a workfare program from long-term unemployed people, she was required to work at the discount retailer Poundland. It's a pound shop for 2 weeks under threat of losing her benefits. And then she and Jameson Wilson, who is an unemployed lorry driver, launched a legal challenge to the Department of Work and Pensions, as the government department that administers benefits. And then she was accused by Ian Duncan Smith, the Secretary of State for Work and Pensions, of being a job snob, as well as by other journalists. And then what happened was that Reilly and Winson won the court case, but then the government used a little-known mechanism that allows for a retrospective change of legislation, so they wouldn't have to pay out money to all the people who'd wrongly had their benefits cut because they didn't want to take part in this program. They said they didn't want to take part in this program. But then more recently, she appealed against the decision and won a partial victory. So what I'm going to focus on now are some of the online reactions to Cait Reilly's case, and specifically newspaper comments. And why newspaper comments? I'm actually drawing again inspiration from Policing the Crisis, which was written kind of long before the internet, but I still think it's interesting because they try to talk about newsmaking in a kind of expanded sense, in a way that not only it was about sort of official news, but also they looked at abusive letters to the editor, and so on. And they argued that the social communication through which public opinion is formed consists of everything from conversations between neighbors, discussions at street corners or in the pub, rumor, gossip, speculation, inside dope, and the organization of public opinion takes place at all these levels of social interchange. So, a lot of the communications they were studying, such as abusive letters, weren't actually made public, but they actually referred to a kind of assumed presence of the public, because you'd see they talked about a lot of statements about people agree with me or people should agree with me. So there's a kind of assumed consensus or an idea of a norm. So inspired by this, I ended up looking at kind of online comment cultures and the ways that these can enforce ideas of debt morality and social conformity and that sort of thing. And if, we all know that it's very easy to dismiss them as kind of, random rantings of, people kind of without a life. But I think what's kind of disturbing about them is they lend a kind of a perceived populist authenticity to news debates, because there's, they kind of presume to be a kind of unmediated speech, and encouraged by the fact that a lot of comments are anonymous. So what I did was I ended up analyzing a selection of comments and articles from the Independent, the Mirror, the Telegraph, and the Sun, kind of using thematic coding. And overall, unsurprisingly, the most unsympathetic perspectives were in the Sun and the Telegraph, though the commenters they took sort of slightly different perspectives, because the Sun was all about a sense of outrage of how dare she try to sue the government, it's a bad attitude. And also, how dare she pursue personally meaningful work? And so the idea that she was volunteering in a museum was actually really controversial. And at what they saw as the taxpayers' expense, though, in all the newspapers, actually, there were comments about the idea that she was doing this on the taxpayer. And of course, the Independent and the Mirror were more sympathetic. And they mostly expressed a sense of outrage at the exploitative nature of the scheme and how profitable corporations could use it to avoid hiring paid staff. But, there was a sense in reading these that I was kind of reading almost the same comments again and again. There was almost a sense that some of them could have been written by the same people. And many of them seemed interchangeable. What I wanted to do here is actually highlight a few of the comments here as kind of raw expressions of anger and resentment. So I wanted to present them here in their materiality, really. Yes, as the assertion said, bad things only happen to bad people. And of course, bad people are never people like us. And that unemployment is the result of individual personal failure. And I can see these comments really, you can see them as almost collective attempts at reassurance to repeatedly say, I'm not like her, or more importantly, this wouldn't happen to someone like me. And here these are comments from the Sun, which are, again, it's about a sense of outrage at a so-called bad attitude and lack of discipline. And the fact that she'd gone to university is key. So I think this girl needs a reality check. Stacking shelves isn't what she envisioned when she graduated. Well, guess what? Sometimes we don't enjoy the jobs we end up doing. I wanted to be an astronaut once. And then she thinks the world owes her just because she went to university and has a degree. If she was actively looking for work as well as volunteering, I wouldn't have a problem, as I know how hard it is, but she is so stuck up and turns her nose down at anything because she thinks he's better than us. So, again, sort of echoing Ian Duncan Smith's comments that she's a job snob, but also I think it's interesting here is the way that this idea of doing a university degree means that she thinks she's better than the rest of us. And so there's a kind of, I think, quite reactionary politics of class happening here in terms of the accusations of her being a snob. Of course, she actually had said to the media that if she actually was offered paid work in Poundland, she would have taken it immediately, but this is all lost in these sorts of comments. So I say this also reflects a belief that in a recession, any kind of personal meaningful work, or such as working, volunteering in a museum, or even the idea of having any kind of career, more than just paying the bills, has become a luxury, and that there's the idea that you should accept any work, even whether it's paid or unpaid. And there's also a kind of assumed consensus in that she thinks she's better than us. I mean, who is the us that's being referred to? Presumably we all, the us is, refers to people who supposedly all agree with each other. And then comments in the Telegraph weren't so much about hard work and discipline. They're more about dismissing her for having made bad life decisions, bad career decisions. So if she'd been unemployed for a long time, the suspicion creeps in that the taxpayer was subsidizing a voluntary workplace in a museum. Should we do this for everyone who wants to be a museum curator or other profession of desirable but narrow prospects, such as a dancer, philosopher, sculptor? So don't even dare think about going into the arts, in other words. That's, and particularly if you don't come from a privileged background, don't you even, even consider going into the arts. So, and a lot of the posts took the form of, I think, quite condescending career advice, including suggestions to go abroad, and particularly Australia, because Australia is a land of milk and honey, right? And without any discussion of the practicalities of doing a remote job search or immigration or the practicalities of relocation, the point was really to berate Cait Reilly for not having pursued these sorts of options, such as going overseas and that sort of thing. And again, her status as an unemployed university graduate was also central to these sorts of dismissals, because this is where, for the Sun commenters, it was more about, she's gone to university, so she's a snob. But here, she's gone to university, but she can't get a graduate level job, so she's a failure and she's made bad life choices. So if the commenters in the Sun and the Telegraph expressed moral outrage and anger, then the Independent and the Mirror were more kind of angry at the exploitative nature of the program. So here's one from the Mirror. Poundland are owned by asset strippers, equity firm, Advent International, who are worth $6 billion, yet somehow they're unable to pay a living wage and need benefit flaves from the DWP. One interesting thing about the Mirror is that you actually have to sign in with a Facebook account to be able to post comments, so they're not anonymous in the same way. And interestingly, there are far fewer of them, because you couldn't sign in as, Fluffy Bunny 1987 or something like that. But also what I did notice as well is there was also a sense of marginality and powerlessness, including assertions about how easily the public accepts exploitative conditions, and also how much politicians ignore us. And here's an example from the Independent. Sadly, we can all get as angry as we want, and we can take to the street in protest. Those of us in work can go on strike, but when those who govern us and answer to other masters, they will just ignore public opinion. So I think this kind of speaks about the kind of marginalization of the public from the political process, the distance of the political class, the lack of representation of the media of any of these sorts of things. But there actually wasn't really much discussion of trying to do anything about this. I mean, the only things I noticed, there was one person started posting a pamphlet from the New Economics Foundation, that argued that to solve the economic crisis, we should have a 35-hour week, for example. I mean, that was being posted around. Some people talked about boycotting the companies that are participating in the scheme. But there wasn't really much talk really about mobilizing. And I would think that this possibly is an indication of, the kind of, online comments in newspapers are possibly not the best place to organize resistance. And of course, I mean, Jodie Dean has talked about, the kind of role of sort of participatory media, and I mean, she sees it as a largely kind of depoliticizing force. I mean, I would kind of disagree, because I have seen it used. I have seen, for example, social media used in sort of protest contexts. I've organized protests using social media myself, but these sorts of contexts are not really the place for this. You could argue instead it's a kind of it's a disempowering kind of forum, despite all the claims that are made about this being a form of democracy, because you're supposedly letting the public speak. But I just wanted to. I mean, and also what happened, what happened a few months ago is that there was also another disturbing thing I noticed was that there was a use of Twitter to basically attack several people who were speaking out, such as the classics professor Mary Beard, for example, ended up made the target of a blog that kind of where people started going on about her genitalia and that sort of thing after she'd been on. A television, sort of a chat show on television, and it was Question Time, and she actually argued that immigrants aren't a big drain on public services in Lincoln, for example. So this was so I think what we started to see is the use of participatory media actually to silence people, I think. But I guess maybe I'm more interested really about what's actually at stake here in attacking those people who challenge the austerity consensus. And I think I wanted to go back again to this idea of on one hand, we're seeing politicians create these very sharp divisions between the kind of good and the bad. On the other hand, because of the kind of economic insecurity that we're all, experiencing, we could very easily be on the sort of wrong side. But I think that as well, and I think, again, the figure of the unemployed graduate just shows how blurry those lines are between the hardworking people and the so-called skivers. But I think it's also useful, again, I think this idea of hard work is a denial of pleasure and resentment through those who don't accept worsening living standards or career prospects without complaining. I mean, I think that's still useful to think about. And I would argue, and again, I'd say that this idea of hard work, I think it's important to think about it beyond the workplace and beyond bad jobs. To again think about the hardships that are involved in living with austerity, because in a sense, for those of us who have lived with very little, we all know that it's time-consuming. It actually takes a lot of work to save money, and And the idea of doing any kind of meaningful work, particularly in the arts, is really kind of, it's seen as not a possibility at all. But I think as well, I think what else is at stake is because if people like Cait Reilly actually speak out, then that raises questions about why other people don't speak out. And so, why do people suffer in silence, for example? So I think it really raises that, I think, quite subversive idea that we all could possibly, we all could speak out as well. And that's why there's so much, I think, at stake at trying to silence these sorts of voices. Yeah, so that's basically it. Okay.
So again, I think we've got time for just one or maybe two questions or responses to Kirsten's paper.
As an unemployed postgraduate, I'll try and answer your question. The reason why people don't speak out is that they start to own the stuff that's said about them, us.
Yeah.
I'm currently having to go to cognitive behavioural therapy organised by the Department of Work and Pensions, which is going to tell me that the problem of not getting a job is about one of perception. It's about the way in which I'm thinking about jobs rather than the fact that there aren't any jobs. And it's amazing how quickly you start to believe this shit.
Yeah.
You start to think, yeah, actually, maybe I do need to rethink my priorities, and all this kind of corporate horseshit starts to take up residency inside your skull. Is the answer, in my experience.
Yeah, and I think it's very easy for that to happen. And one thing I actually found out is that they've been actually using, I heard they've been using self-help books and training at job centers, that sort of thing. So it is this very kind of individualizing, personalizing, psychologizing idea of unemployment. But as well, another aspect of the underclass discourse is that, Ruth Levitas has written a really interesting book about this, where she talked about how it was connected to the shift in sort of discourse about unemployment. That basically, it said that basically, if you're unemployed, then it's because you have personal problems, you've made bad personal choices, and some of this was actually drawn by it was drawn on the kind of French social policy where if you were unemployed, you would meet regularly with a caseworker who would actually ask you all these questions about your personal life. Questions that would seem actually quite intrusive, but it's sort of based on the idea that unemployment is the result of psychological problems. And actually, and the Mercer Lazzarato book was actually quite interesting because he actually has interview transcripts with people who talk about these sorts of meetings with caseworkers and the sorts of things they've had to tell them. Because they have to talk about things like their relationships and their living arrangements, that sort of thing. But I would argue that it's not only, I would say that it's not only the kind of, those who are unemployed. I would say that, there's also, because that's the thing about precarity, right? It also affects those of us who are in work, because there's a sense that you could, you're always, you're under threat of losing your job. And I've also seen, for example, colleagues around me talk about, the idea of they lose their job, it's their own fault, for example. So I think it's really kind of deep, I think this all goes very deep, I would say.
Thanks ever so much, Kirsten. That was great. I wanted to get your opinion on kind of ideological attacks on work. So a kind of a counter-ideology, if you like, that either looks to expand the concept of work in a manner like the Wages for Housework campaign in the 70s, for example, which perhaps clearly still relevant today, but could be expanded on something like Facebook. Jodie Dean says 1 billion users, 1 billionaire. If you're unemployed and you're spending your time on Facebook, you're actually working by even a fairly kind of conservative definition of work. You're producing value for capital. So could there be a productive in calling for wages for Facebook, for example, or wages for tweeting? And I'm going to say Kathy Week's book on anti-work and feminist issues.
I would say yes, it would be useful, and I think I think that Dallas Smythe's ideas I think are actually really, because he talked back in the sort of 70s about the idea that we're kind of giving eyeballs to advertisers, and we're actually television audiences are doing work.
Absolutely.
But I would also as well, another thing about sort of the use of social media is that I think there's increasing expectation for people to use it for employability purposes, to basically promote their workplace on Facebook or on Twitter. And I know that sort of thing it's not something you do for pleasure. It's not like even posting photos of cats, right? It's you know what I mean? You are actually marketing the company you work for. So I mean, I think it's very right to actually try to claim wages for it. I mean, the other thing is that they're harvesting vast amounts of marketing data as well. So even if you are posting photo of cats, they're still recording all sorts of information about your personal tastes, who your friends are, and that sort of thing. So I would say yes, definitely.
I'd just like to support that point and say that the category of work itself, I mean, clearly what our understandings of work and what work is have dramatically and radically changed in the shift from industrial to neoliberal forms of capital in the global north. And there's a way in which I think to politicise these debates and to resist them, you have to not resist them by reproducing accounts of kind of the worthy, good person who wants to work, and you have to actually do it by critically rethinking the category of labour and itself and its relationship to capital. But that isn't the point I wanted to make. I just want to say that there's some really interesting work going on that's revitalising actually 70s debates about social reproduction and value, and some interesting work came out of Occupy actually on those ideas as well. The question I want to ask, which relates to this talk, but also to Dominic's talk in particular, is about how disgust is performed in public spheres. So one of the things about the online materials that you've shared with us is they're very much about the public performance of disgust as a pleasurable activity. Yeah. And it's a pleasurable and communal activity, which, like a bitch session that we all engage in sometimes, it is done in a very particular type of mode, quite often anonymously by people in online posts. And there's a sense in which it is performative. It's not necessarily the truth, if you like, of what somebody believes or feels. And the people who even make these posts are themselves quite often in the categories that are being denigrated in the story. So there's a kind of set of complications around posting and the kind of the performance and eliciting of disgust, which is a little bit like in the culture wars, the kind of pleasure of the right-wing moral panic and being involved and engaging in that. And I'd just like to introduce the question of how performance of disgust as a kind of pleasurable form of engagement is an important part when we're talking about moral panics and these kind of affects.
Okay, I guess I would say that I would argue that one of the things, I don't want to get into the affect debate here again, but it's kind of there was a sense when sort of reading through hundreds of these comments that it did feel like some kind of collective performance of it was because you can sort of if you claim that it was just basically saying, oh, she's so terrible, I'm not like that, over and over and over and over again, and that's very reassuring, I would say. But also you've got the sense, I think particularly the Telegraph comments, you got the sense that they're actually having fun at finding all kinds of ways of attacking her, to the point where people actually started making things up, very, very obviously. As you would, and these comments they're not the truth, because you can say whatever you want, really. So, but I don't think you should actually see them as the truth. I think we should see them as performative. But one comment was, she wasn't actually volunteering in a museum, she was fanning around in her uncle's pen shop. And it was kind of like, and some people tried to do the right thing and said, well, actually, this is the website of the museum she was volunteering for, and it was a real museum. She wasn't making it up. It is, it's for real. But there's a sense that didn't matter, because then people wanted to think that she was fanning around in her uncle's pen shop more than to think about what the experience of volunteering in a museum actually was. So, and so I think what it was about, I think there was a kind of, on one hand, there was a kind of anger at how dare she try to sue the government, but there was also a sense of we can have fun putting her down in any way possible. I think in some ways it's similar to how When you think about how the tabloid press sort of puts down celebrities or other kinds of public figures, there's something that seemed kind of quite similar, except it wasn't being enacted by tabloid journalists, it was being enacted by these anonymous commenters. And the anonymity, the anonymity I think would make it even more pleasurable because you're not accountable for anything you say, and there's no fallout if you say something that's controversial and that sort of thing. So I mean.